All right, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. We had a little bit of a adventure here getting our new person in, but that was exciting, and we're glad to have her here. So, welcome everybody. Today we're talking about what do world builders mean by world. And the thing about it is, okay, so the reason I thought of this is partly because I got a bunch of new people subscribing to my YouTube channel, and I thought, you know, I really want to do another kind of introductory topic. And the other thing is that I find that when I go to cons, very often what you'll find is you'll have world building panels, and you can't necessarily tell what you're going to get just by the word world building, because some of the panels will veer off immediately into let's create a planet and try to evolve aliens on it.
Right.
And others will veer off into, well, I'm writing a story. How do I make sure that the world in the story comes across powerfully? So obviously those are two possible interpretations of what world building means, and they're not really they're not always disambiguated, because we tend to use the same term for both. And so I wanted to kind of explore what this thing that we are doing is, and what it means, and how it varies across contexts, if that makes sense. Because so say, for example, we had Dr. Heidi Stauffer on the show a little while ago to talk about geology, and that was really cool. But we ended up in orbital mechanics. It was awesome, and I want to have her on the show again to talk about geology and how it affects our daily life. And I think those are, in fact, two of the faces of world building: the daily life side of things, the story setting side of things, and the I need to know every detail about how this planet works kind of thing. Part of it is a focus question, because if you're writing a short story, world building is not necessarily going to be small, but it needs to be bite-sized enough that it can be processed by a person who's reading a shorter piece of work.
Juliet, focus or scope?
Both. So scope, yes. Also focus, which is part of what we use to control scope, if that makes sense. But yes, so where do we go from here? So let's talk about okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start by picking it up from the angle of looking at it in different genres. Okay? Because world building is a word that is usually applied to this in science fiction and fantasy. And this is partly the scope question, right? A lot of people come into it assuming that what we mean and what we're going to talk about on the show is how to create a massive world in every single detail, from orbital mechanics to geology to climate to architecture to everything, and have a massive world Bible that you spent 30 years making. And that's not
obviously not, Juliet, because you forgot the conlang.
Yeah, right. I forgot the conlang, sure, and the manners, and the So some people think that what we're doing is creating a world Bible and a completely full-fledged alternate reality, which some people are, right? I'm not going to say that's not what world builders do.
I'm going to say that when I get asked to help on somebody else's world building, what I talk about is how much divergence are you building into what the reader is probably familiar with. And there are ways of writing genre work that is essentially within the world, the consensual reality that we're all part of. And then there are different viewpoints, which is where we get into these troubles when people are writing diversity and inclusion and all these other things.
Uh-huh.
But I think that it's important to consider that when we're writing, we're never not using one of these giant worlds.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that if you're using the one that we live in by default, A, you may not have examined everything about it, but B, you don't have to have considered it before you start writing, because you're just going to pull from your giant toolbox of, well, this is just the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
But that itself is a giant world with customs and manners and animals and geology and all these other things.
Yep.
Yeah, people don't
It's like
talk
real world
about
fanfic.
Sorry. People
What are you
don't
saying?
talk about world building in terms of like litfic, but litfic also requires world building.
Yep.
And so what I see a lot of as an editor is that people will not have put any world building thought into that, and then you reach this divergence point where you're writing urban fantasy, and then you step a little farther and farther into genre.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a world there that you're conveying.
Absolutely.
You mean the one where New York is full of white people and young people with really marginal jobs can afford giant apartments? That kind of world building?
We're all
Yeah.
friends here.
Friends world. The one part we did world building.
That's a built world, but
It's a very built world.
we don't talk about it because it's not genre.
No, it's and I think that's important. So one of the things that I always like to point out is one of the books whose world building really, really impressed me in the first entry point was The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And that is set in Sweden. Now, it's our world. There are some reality stretching aspects to it, but it's not what we would consider a genre work, right? On the other hand, I haven't spent a lot of time in Sweden. And so in order for me to enter into that story and have a really strong sense of where I was and what kind of people were there and what the environment felt like, there needed to be a lot of really strong world building. And I was incredibly impressed with it when I read it.
I think that's why I really love John Irving.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's writing about this very New England, very WASP setting that he's very clear that it needs to be laid out, and that the world itself is a character or a really strong part of what makes a story work. It's not a story about any place in particular, non-specific. It is a very specific story about a very specific culture in a very specific place.
Yep.
Into which all of us who are reading from outside of that are finding points of empathy and similarity, and or sort of gawking and revulsion or whatever else. But clarity of scene, I think, is what I want to say, and structure and place.
Historical fiction kind of bridges between that literary built world and genre fiction, because you have to evoke a time and a place that may not be familiar to the reader, or it may be familiar in the wrong ways and having the wrong ideas about it. The whole stupid idea that medieval Europe was all white, and trying to build a world that's realistic and sometimes the point is to educate the reader. This is what it was really like, or at least close enough to as we can get accuracy, because after a while it's just like it's a matter of approximation to what reality actually was, especially if you get before the age of common documents.
Yeah.
I also talk about the distance between the projected reader and the world that the characters are moving in.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's really the important thing about what are you describing, what are you not describing. And so
when you say projected reader, you mean the intended audience?
I specifically say projected reader because I think that there is some sort of person for whom the author is, whoever's writing it, is telling the story to, that they may not have thought about. And
Mhm.
when I say expected audience, a lot of people just say, well, everybody.
Right.
And so I like you specifically, when I'm coaching this, I like to use the term projected reader specifically to create an awareness of somebody is going to be reading this.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think they're going to know? And what do you think they're not going to know? And what do you think they need to know? And the things that you do and don't explain have to be about what you think they're going to know.
Uh-huh.
And so this is the same thing, whether you're doing a secondary world story or a story not set in the world that you think the reader will know. So if you're writing about a YA, a teen series but you think that, let me switch that back. If you're writing a story set in a high school and you think your readers are in high school, there are things you will or won't explain
Yeah.
based on what you think they know, as compared to if you think your reader is an adult who's no longer in school or somebody who went to a very different schooling system.
Mm-hmm.
And how much detail do you put in, right?
Yep.
And there's also the issue of, I like to talk about, there are some authors who really like to write every single physical detail of a scene so that you can paint it
Yeah.
from the instructions. And so you know that the protagonist is this high, this tall, and this wide, and this blonde, and this blue-eyed, right? And
Yeah.
for some stories that is important, and for some stories that's just what some of us have been trained to write into our descriptions.
Mm-hmm.
But is that really the important description? And what does it lead you to write if you assume you have to do descriptions like that?
Yeah. I mean, so this is actually really interesting focus issue, right? It's how much do you need to put in there? And I think how much you need to put in there has to do with a couple of different things. It definitely with what you're calling the projected reader, right? But also what you as the author know. But you as the author are likely to know far more than you can actually fit into a scene. And so what you put in there is going to have a lot to do with what the intent of the scene is and what the mood of the scene is and all that kind of thing.
This is where my great love of close third comes in, right? Because
yes, you see, close third is awesome. I love it.
I know things that my protagonist doesn't know and they don't need to know.
Yes.
It's a lot about, like, what does the reader need to know? What's the space between the reader's assumption and what's happening that you need to fill in? And that's where I think world building really lives, is in the space between, like Kat said, the projected reader's assumed world and the world that you're writing.
Well, and I think if I can give a little extra sort of granularity to that, what you're dealing with is every time that you put a word on the page, that word is going to access a contextual schema for a reader, right? And so one of the things that you're doing as you continue to describe is managing how much of that schema actually ends up solidifying as you go forward. Because people will over pour their expectations into a piece very easily. And so part of your job is to sort of cut off some possibilities by being specific about particular things. Also to direct readers' attention in particular ways, right?
I like to talk about Tolkien's potato problem.
Mm-hmm.
In that, once you introduce the word potato and you have secondary world Europe, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes into there.
Yeah.
And sure, I'm willing to hand wave and you need potato, but if you have it at all set into this world and you've now done something like some authors saying that there were no people in the Turtle Island and below landmass, that you really can't have potatoes in Europe, or you've created a world building problem for yourself. Because in theory, although your reader might not be that astute, potato ought to evoke a whole bunch of other stuff, right?
Well, you're
Tomatoes
talking
ought to
about the
evoke a whole
Columbian
bunch of other stuff.
exchange.
I am.
Yeah.
But, what are you actually building into your world? What are you assuming? If you say silk, it carries certain contextual assumptions. And so, but just to jump hard over into deep future science fiction, which we were talking about in other episodes recently, we have assumptions that we've built up as a culture about what's likely that we don't have to explain. Ray guns, faster than light travel, teleportation, faster than light communication. It's part of the toolbox that is allowed unless you've really decided as an author to constrain yourself from that. And I know there are readers who really love being forced out of that frame and being forced to confront exactly how long communication takes at slower than light speeds. But, there are choices that we're making, but we are pulling from a big cultural assumption of what things mean. English forces us to do
I think
things.
we're also looking at a question of how deep do you want to go? Like, as a storyteller, if you have somebody look up at the moon, how much do you need to know about the moon, right? In order for the story to function. And the answer to that obviously is going to change depending on what you want to do with it.
Right, and there's also what are you writing into the story explicitly on the page, and what are you thinking about, and just putting, basically, it's the iceberg problem. I mean, how much is actually coming on the page, and how much are you actually working out, but not actually putting on the page that's supporting the ballast of everything else? Yep. How much are you, the author, thinking about these things? Like, okay, so there's a moon in the sky. Do you start thinking about orbital mechanics and the size of the moon and how much light it puts out, or not? It's really up. Is it plot or story relevant even?
Is it character relevant? Because if you've written yourself an astrophysicist, you probably need to have figured that out.
Yes. Well,
as opposed to you're writing a small child who, oh, look, there's a big light in the sky.
Good point.
Well, and the thing is, there are some contexts in which we have conflicts between those two viewpoints. I'm thinking specifically about the Star Trek episode Darmok, where it was like, I was always kind of shocked by, this had to be placed in the Star Trek world where there were certain kinds of assumptions about technology and interaction and that kind of stuff. And then we had this language concept, which was really fascinating, but I couldn't figure out how to get the two to kind of connect in any logical way. And so I kind of had to say, I'm going to set that aside as a premise problem and enjoy the episode.
Jed Hartman likes to talk about author points and how the reader comes into the story with a certain number of author points, which, varies depending upon how much trust do they have in the author. If it's somebody that has written a thing that you loved before, so you're coming in with high expectations and you're going to let them slip up a bunch of ways, or maybe it reduces the number of author points you give them because you are going to be really harsh on them for deviation. But I think Darmok is a great example of, it's just, don't poke that or it's going to fall apart terribly. And it could only be told in that way because we've already established a great deal of love and affection for Technobabble. Yeah. And it really is a consequence of all of us accepting the Technobabble, right? And the ways that it's taught us to accept, oh, yes, we're going to flim-flammerate the phlogiston. And we're like, oh, yay, good. Look, this is the way the language works. Would we accept that in a completely different series? I kind of think not. I mean, if that were the pilot, what would we have done?
We'd be like, what?
Yeah, with the you're right. The years of trusting Star Trek allow us to actually handle that. Whereas if it was, even if it was a Star Trek derivative, you'd go like, what the heck are you doing in this episode? And it would throw you out of the story. So I like your author point idea.
I don't mean to divert onto Star Trek
Yes, you do.
extensively, but I will say that I didn't find the language concept impossible, right? I didn't find it 100% implausible. I just found it mismatched with the environment around it, which is why I tried to take that language concept and do something different with it.
Giant grains of salt the size of those really big rock monsters on various alien planets. Well, I mean, but going back to Trek, as long as we're perseverating there, I will say that I have not watched the second season of Discovery because I really, really love the more recent instantiations of Klingons, and I really don't like Discovery's Klingons. And so it's a world building detail that I don't like because I really love Mark Okrand's original version of the Klingon language, and I don't like the new way that they're doing it on Discovery because for me it breaks my world building, it breaks my trust, it causes me to question everything else, and this is the thing that we talk about a lot, right? Suspension of disbelief. And I've been hearing people talk more about sense of wonder, but I think suspension of disbelief is really important.
It is, and I often refer to it as a sort of contract between the reader and the author, and you can kind of bend the contract, but there's a certain point at which it snaps. But I think it's also different for different people. So,
I keep telling people that in theory, there is space for all sorts of different ways of writing. And there's a space for that very comic book telegraphed writing. And then there's Chip Delaney writing these really, really dense things.
Mm-hmm.
And not everybody has to be writing for the same audience.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you guys, because I know you guys, a lot of you write things. What is the indispensable part of world building for you in your writing?
Oh God.
I actually have an answer because we just had my co-author and I just had a huge conversation about this last week, and hands down, it was what can your characters use as a metaphor?
Sorry?
What can your characters use as a metaphor?
Okay.
So if you're comparing something, if you're talking about the moon, if you're talking about somebody's skin color, what are you thinking of? Like, can you think of a potato? Or are you thinking of a rock? If you're on a desert world, can you use water metaphors? Or is everything a water metaphor because you're on a desert world and people are trying to call back to,
Yeah.
That's a fun bit of world building. And what is your framework? So, I mean, for me, I had a scene that began with a character cursing, and I actually used a very modern contemporary curse word, and then I kind of went, is that really the word she'd use? And I actually had her note in story, and I may edit it out yet, that it was anachronistic because she was feeling like she'd been tossed into an anachronistic experience in that moment. That she'd been deliberately doing something along the lines of one of us using Elizabethan curses because all of a sudden the tech level around us has gone Elizabethan. So, expressing that moment of disgust at what is going on around.
Well, we do anachronistic things.
Right. So, but I also have built entire rubrics of cursing based on what is the thing that this character is upset by in the world. Is it really sexuality and religiosity and sacrilege and filth? Is that really what they're upset about? Right. I have this conversation a lot, and I realized that no, this person, this is an engineer on a spaceship. What they're really pissed off about is randomness, non-reproducibility, weird leaks. I mean, there are all sorts of things that are much more upsetting in that world than whether or not you're going to use words about coitus.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, a lot of my essential world building is, I think, in the line of what I said earlier, of how does this character think about themselves in relation to the world?
Mm-hmm.
So
character is obviously indispensable.
not just character, but
But the way the character perceives the world.
Mm-hmm.
right.
Judgment. This is I will always sing the praises of character judgment.
Marginalization versus privilege, because of the things I write, but just what is their interaction with the world? Do they expect a world that's very orderly? Do they expect a world that's very chaotic?
Mm-hmm.
Do they expect a world where everything is a struggle against their environment? Do they expect a world where they're completely integrated into it? And I've written a bunch of different things about all these different things because I find the exploration interesting. And also, because I'm writing science fiction, what do they see when they see something or someone from an entirely alien context? And so the things that are shocking are indicative of what is normal to the character's viewpoint, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can do a lot of talk about what is normal and what somebody finds normal by talking about what's weird to them. And I think Vonnegut actually did that really, really well in a different context, because he sort of took his characters and by making them these sort of outsiders perceiving what we think of as a very, very normal world, was able to do world building in that space.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so talking about what your character thinks is normal without ever saying it it's almost an exploration of privilege.
So I have a context in the story that I have about 80% written, where the character notes that humans are bilaterally symmetrical and have a front and a back. And the fact that they think that these things are notable says something about the character's context. And so I've had people complain that I did not explain what these aliens look like. And I'm like, yes, but when is the last time you described yourself or any of your characters as being bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, and having a front and a back?
Yeah.
Right? Because it's
you
not a thing that
can
we
assume that
describe.
they're not bilaterally symmetrical. I mean, a reader ought to be able to make that assumption from the character's note of that.
Right.
They should be able to make that assumption, and
That at least
sort of
carved out.
annoys me when people can't
So Paul, do I
that.
heard you moaning when I first asked the question. Have you come around to something you'd like to say about indispensable parts of world building for you?
Indispensable parts of world building. I like to think about how family structures work, or what kinds of relationships do people have. I have to think about, okay, how do marriages work? Are there marriages? How are kids raised? Are they raised communally, separately? How do people form what is the smallest nuclear family unit? Is it the default American? Not necessarily. It could be clan structures. It could be, okay, all the children are raised separately and have very strange interactions with their parent, all strange to us, not until they're reached a certain amount of age. I have to think about why would the society do this? And then what does that say about the world I've built?
Mm-hmm.
And I keep like to experiment with that. It's like, okay, let's do it this way this time. And that leads me down really weird paths of story that I didn't necessarily expect.
Mm-hmm.
Like I can get myself tied in knots.
Can't we all? Cliff, do you have something that you think is indispensable in world building?
Well, I don't know what you've everything that's been said since I joined late. So I like what Kat had to say about bilaterally symmetrical, that implied world building, right? Mm-hmm. So I would say that what is indispensable in world building is that which the reader needs to know to make them make sense of the world, right? And that varies from story to story, also from length of work to length of work. What the world building needed for an epic fantasy trilogy is not the same as the world building needed for a flash fiction, right? And so Did we talk about marked and unmarked categories?
Nope. Let's do it.
A little bit.
Okay, so
Oh, not in those words.
unmarked category is the default,
Mhm.
right? It comes from anthropology. And so, like in, American culture of describing a human, the unmarked category is a white, male, cisgender, straight, Christian, Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
Who's bilaterally symmetrical.
Yes, who is bilaterally symmetrical and has a front and a back. And, probably votes Republican. I don't know. But anyway.
Depends on where you put him.
Yeah, I suppose.
Well,
But, definitely, the unmarked category is a Yankee and not a Southerner, for example. All of those things, right? It speaks English. So in your world, the reader, whatever the reader considers unmarked categories, not just for people, but for things about the world, like cars are a thing, whatever. That's the assumption that the reader brings to the first word of the first sentence. And if you want to make sure the reader understands that something is different, you have to build that out explicitly or implicitly.
I like marking the normally unmarked categories a lot.
Well, the bilaterally symmetrical with the front and the back. That was a
Yes.
brilliant bit of marking an unmarked category. A friend of mine once joked that he had written a humorous SF story in which two characters were alien characters were saying to each other, being radially symmetrical is great. I just love being radially symmetrical. Yeah, I agree. Isn't that wonderful? Having a casual conversation about how much they love being radially.
When is the last time you had a conversation about really enjoying being bilaterally symmetrical?
Yesterday?
I have had such conversations.
I was building cabinets.
Probably at a con. Probably after midnight, and I think alcohol is involved.
Likely.
All right. Alcohol, intoxicants. I find that we have this entire beloved genre of the saloon story.
Mm.
And I find it really interesting that we assumed that everybody has a saloon. And that often it's liquid. And I'm like, I'm not sure that that's actually as universal as our story tropes would have us believe.
Yeah.
But somehow that's just become one of those, well, of course there's the saloon. There's the Star Trek-ish saloon and the Western saloon and the saloon in Indiana Jones where you might get shot in other ways. And it's just, wow, we have these intoxicants and violence. Mm.
Sure. Violence and intoxicants. It's a good name for a band. Intoxicants and violence. There was a wonderful bit of world building in Futurama where Fry is transported through cryonic suspension from the year 2000 to the year 3000, and they're flying around and they get attacked by space pirates, and Leela, who's the pilot and is local to that time, says, "It's space pirates," and Fry's like, "What?" And she says, "Pirates in space." And of course their spaceships have Jolly Rogers and sails, and they have parrots and peg legs, and they fly around in space.
Because all of our 17th century pirate assumptions have been brought into.
Yeah, right.
Well,
it's like a saloon, right? Of course there are.
I believe that in that world you're contractually required to have a singing mouse wearing pants.
And an evil robot Santa Claus celebrating Xmas, trying to kill everyone.
And that was the moment the dive went off the rails permanently.
Hey, Futurama is the master of world building. I mean,
how do you follow up
watch
on that?
any episode of Futurama and you get a master class in zany world building.
Well, so so let's talk about that, because a lot of what we talk about on this show is these really, in-depth, highly integrated worlds, where we're concerned about consistency and where variation occurs, being careful not to be too consistent yet, making sure that everything interconnects. this is obviously not the only way to approach world building, right?
Right.
And so
Right. You could start from the inductive approach. You could just start writing and build your world. Right. I mean, you were talking earlier about the giant story Bible that you write before actually you write a page, but not all writers go about that way. They just like they start writing and they build out the world from what they're putting on the page and basically building the iceberg underneath them as they go along. It's not I can't think that way, but there are apparently a lot of writers that's the way they do it. They build their world in an organic sort of bricolage sort of way. Like this implies this and this implies this, and I'll write some more. Like, okay, then that goes
well, and
on.
the further you go, the more questions you have to answer, and the more questions you have to answer, the more you have to kind of think. There's this thing that I often see when I'm working in critique with people, and it's what I call an exploratory draft, right? And I think that's what I would call what you're talking about, Paul, where, you are exploring a world by writing about it. I think a lot of really interesting kinds of metrics and assumptions and it's really interesting to ask the question of what is steering you under those conditions.
That's what I do. That's how I write.
A lot of people do.
I'm someone who writes like that.
I usually, I have a jumping off point, and an idea and a concept and characters and plot. So I have to have those things in place, and then I have an idea of the world. But every time I've tried to write like big worlds, I never end up actually doing anything in the world, and just somehow get really hung up, and I don't know why.
You know what? This is one of the things I think is important about dive into world building is I really try to make sure that we talk about this from different angles, that we're not always approaching this from the, highly matrixed, super, hyper realistic, whatever, because we all agree, people don't all even agree about what's realistic, or whether realism is valuable, right? So we need to make sure that we're keeping our options open.
So I'm just going to note that the story that I have 80% written about the aliens that really want to note about the humans being bilaterally symmetrical and having a front and a back, that was actually all I knew about the story when I started writing it. I didn't actually have everything else plotted out.
Do you go back and backfill then? Because I have an author that I work with, and she falls in love with words. And so she'll write a story just to be able to use the word Zeppelin and Malachite and liminal. And all of a sudden, she's got 4,000 words on the page. And she kind of has an idea where she's going. And then she hands it to me. And basically my job is to tell her the rules of the world that she has set up. Because in these 4,000 worlds, she'll build a consistent world, but then she won't know what the rules are to move forward into the next part of the plot.
So I note that there are authors who actually managed to get published in that state.
Peter Beagle looking at you.
So, okay, but that's an amazing work of. So the thing is, there is a point at which I noticed that, the fans will create their own wiki about your world and try to make everything all fit together, and it doesn't quite, but they'll hammer and saw and fan wank and hand wave.
I'll take that.
So that is a way to do that. When I'm writing, the reason it's 80% written is because I didn't know where it went. Because all I had was this vivid thing and the setting. And so yes, I go back and backfill, but that's because I go, wait, but then, and then I end up scrapping the entire draft and then rewriting it. And then a friend will say, hey, can I read anything you've written? And I'm going, I have story shards at this point because I've taken the story and I've deconstructed it again because I want to build in a thing. And now it's it's like disassembling the clock because you needed to add a different hand to it. I do not necessarily advise this thing that I do, but
Well, I think that shards is an interesting way of putting it, because I think one good metaphor for this is to talk about how story worlds kind of grow like crystals,
okay.
because we have these internal and often subconscious sets of expectations and principles that we may not be fully aware of. But they will cause certain things to feel natural when they latch on to other things. And by the time you've worked your way through the lattice over here, it may not connect back over here, but there are chaotic elements to things like language and society. So it may not have to.
Story broken, add new planet. Sorry. Clearly it's different because they're from a different universe. I feel like we should be talking about comic books and the way that comic books so often reboot and retcon and how origin stories get completely altered, and that it's
Well,
just
they're
sort of
almost
carry
fanfic
on,
of
carry
themselves.
through, right? Yes. So,
And it's kind of expected in comic books. I mean, you wouldn't expect that sort of constant reboot and reinvention in many other works. Or it gets a lot of pushback. Or in comic books, it's practically expected that, okay, we're going to reboot Spider-Man again because we can.
Yeah.
Well, a certain amount of your commentary will get really violent, and depending upon what the author's identity is, never mind. That's an entirely different episode. But I think that it is about the shared metaphor and what author points are and what the reader's expectations are. How much consistency do they expect? Because, what's really terrifying to me is the people who will codify something like gore and turn it into an entire life framework that I don't know was originally intended. But boy, people will, if you don't actually, as the creator, create the complete environment, sometimes people will just do it for you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's how much do you need to do? How much is required? I think that all of us have seen examples of every part of that scale, and that every time you say, well, this is the way, that somebody will have an exception. So
I think comic books, though, like, you're not just dealing with author points, you're dealing with character points. And that people are so invested. And comic books and the reboots, I feel like almost operate in the same space as fanfic.
Yeah,
I think we were just saying that. It's fanfic of itself.
Yeah, you want to spend more time with the character. And there's no real way to keep pushing the timeline forward. So you just go to another one. It's fine. It's fine. OC.
Is this where we talk about Star Trek or Star Wars? And I didn't think that's the way we were building the world, but I guess so.
I mean, Star Wars has had such fundamental world building problems from the beginning. Where, oh, Lord Vader, your outdated religion is. I'm like, really? Because this guy's force choking you, and the Emperor? Did you miss the Emperor? Like, you work for him. Like, it's only been 20 years.
Yeah.
20 years is not enough time for outdating anything.
Like, this religion is clearly, like, it's been 20 years since the Clone Wars. Get yourself together. Where did you grow up?
But I'm realizing that we actually live in the reality where, oh, your outdated blah 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 is the kind of thing we actually hear from people using giant bully pulpits, and they're talking about something like civil rights or.
But he wasn't. He was an employee. If my personal came to me and was like, your belief structure, I realized that we work for the same church, but can we talk about this? No, I forced him to.
And this is how she came on to dive into world building and made sure that George Lucas hated her forever. It's okay. He hates me too. Maybe
No,
not.
and like I have a deep, deep love for the Star Wars universe.
Yeah.
I really do. I played through Knights of the Old Republic. I couldn't kill R2. Like I can't do the dark side quests. But that has bothered me since I was like this big.
Yeah.
I will say that again, this is one of those places where we just kind of hand wave, but I'm watching people trying to make it a coherent narrative and getting terribly frustrated. And I don't know what you do. I think you just treat it like a comic book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting because there are a lot of different world building models, I think.
So Disney right now has the Lucas Story Group, which is a group of people whose job it is to maintain continuity of the films, the comics, the TV shows, the video games, the Mickey Mouse hats that are Star Wars themed. I don't know, whatever, right? You know, certainly the part of Disneyland that is Star Wars themed. So that's an approach to world building, right? And in media, if you're not an author sitting alone in your chamber or writing with your co-writer alone in your chamber, then you have a whole group of people and you have to like coordinate the work of a bunch of people. And then you need to do a Bible, right? And
Yeah, I think
maintain that as a living document.
I'm trying to think of who it was who came on the show to talk about just this stuff. I think it may have been Monica Valentinelli.
Yeah.
Who was talking about her experiences working within shared worlds, and that was really fascinating to me. You know, here are the things that you can't touch. Here's where you can innovate. It's a very, it's a fascinatingly different kind of process from what I prefer to work with.
I love shared world. I love them so much. It's one of my favorite world building things because you collaborate and you kind of get enough of a world that everyone can then go play in it. And then everybody comes back with these stories and these ideas, whether it's a writer's group doing Flash in a shared world or the whatever in Hell series. And everybody comes back with these. And then all of a sudden, these are all canon. And then before you can move forward with your own next piece, you have to reconcile it. And I love that. I love that process.
And Wildcards has been going for like how many volumes now?
No, a lot.
Trying to be consistent, you know.
And back in the day, Thieves World went for a number of volumes before
Is
finally.
that a thing that actually happens outside of genre fiction?
Sure. There's outside of SF genre, you mean, or like, are you thinking in literary fiction or?
Yeah, I'm like,
any
is
genre
that a
other than
literary
us? Because like it happens in Sherlock Holmes, right? I mean, there's the Sherlock Holmes canon, and then if you're going to write like the Beekeeper's Daughter series, for example, right, then you have to be consistent with Doyle and yourself, and those are the two things. And then you usually don't have to worry about anyone else who's also writing professional Sherlock Holmes fanfic.
The Holmesiana has gone into so many different directions at this point that I think that I don't see it as a shared world as much as I see it as a it's mythic, right? It's not so much the stories have to align. It's kind of like there are these Greek myths that don't form a consistent narrative because they're all about taking the archetype and telling your story using those particular characters.
It's a little bit like growing a tree where you've got the trunk and then the branches go kind of wow.
Sure, yeah.
Sure. Well, which is why I brought up, Futurama, and also shows like even more so Family Guy, which there is not. I remember one DVD commentary on Futurama where they're talking about an early episode where they decided not to do a joke because it would strain the world, really. And then they were laughing about it because in later seasons they would have totally gone for the gag because whatever the gag was more important than the world building. And the universe could hold together on character, plot, and gags alone, right? Yeah, there's a mostly consistent world, and then like in Family Guy, there's all these flashbacks, which are all gags. And if you tried to create a coherent history narrative for that family based on all those flashbacks, it would be impossible, right?
I think actually that this is something that we're hitting on something important. We're bumping up against the end of the hour, but we're hitting on something important here, which is that when we set expectations not only for what will occur within a world, but what kind of consistency or lack of consistency an audience can expect. And to have a sudden change in that often strains people.
I suddenly, as Cliff was talking, thought that what we don't talk about, that I've never heard anybody talk about, is the elasticity of a world, where some things that you can bend and they snap back into place, and sometimes you've just broken the thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like it would be like in Futurama if there were an episode where Fry suddenly became cruel and callous and there was no external explanation like brain slugs or something. By the end of the episode, that would break the world, right?
Yeah.
But having, something that's inconsistent with episode 3 of season 2, nobody cares, because the important thing is character in that series.
I also want to think about the difference between episodic storytelling and sort of that kind of storytelling over an arc, and episodic storytelling which is not allowed an arc. Because there's an episode of Leverage that I'm very, very angry about, because there is a character who had an enormous amount of, I'm sorry, it's not Leverage, it's the Librarians. They live in the same.
They live the same
they live in the same emotional space for me. So there's an episode of the Librarians where a character has a huge amount of emotional growth, but because of the decision about how this world works, they did not allow that character's growth to actually become permanent, and they wiped it at the end of the episode.
Oh.
And I just am devastated because of the character I love a lot, and I really wanted him to grow. And there is a difference between having that sort of, it's not even elasticity at that point, it's just
Rigidity?
It's a rigidity, and it's a certain kind of
calcification.
Plasticity that doesn't allow for, you can bend it, but it has to go back, as opposed to a plasticity where it actually
almost
just
like
sort of
the way people
molds.
treat time travel.
Yeah.
Sure.
The big reset button. By the end of the episode, we got to go back to status quo ante.
Right.
And then I woke up.
Yeah, and then you woke up. Yeah, and it's about satisfying for that reason. Yeah.
So, right. Do you allow shift or not is an interesting thing in one of these giant shared world or rules-based storytelling systems.
Which takes us back to Star Wars, and as they're moving into this more sandboxy world and letting creators play, how committed are they now to this specific war narrative that is going to have to go on forever so that people can keep telling stories in it. And you can tell these very, very interesting, micro stories, I guess Rogue One, where you have small humans against epic backdrop, which is one of my favorite genres. But you have to keep the epic
war
behind the epic background static in order for those small humans to have their arcs.
There's a problem with deciding that your world is based on a war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you do if your genre is a war story, right? You can never have peace, or you can only have temporary peace.
Don't talk to me about that. I'm writing war story.
Yeah. MASH managed to make the Korean War last 11 years.
Yeah.
I know, right? It lasted longer than the actual Korean War.
Yes.
By about 10 years.
That's what happens when you make one war stand in for a different one. But
All right, you guys. Well, I hate to say it, but we have been going for almost an hour now. And it's well after 5. So I thank you. This turned into really interesting thoughts. I appreciate you all being here and contributing. And for now, I will stop the broadcast, but I will say that I managed to pull in a really exciting guest for May. She'll be here on Friday, May 31st. Jamie Go is going to come on the show.
Yay,
nice.
Jamie.
So I'm very excited about that. And so we'll have to have a special schedule that week, but I'm really happy
Awesome.
to let everybody know. And for now, I will stop the broadcast. Thank you all for being here.